Hey guys, as always, I hope you're all doing great. In this video, we will talk about the speculative biology behind Rodan, specifically about the incarnation that we can see in the monsterverse and which I find to be one of the most interesting monsters, at least aesthetically, in this series of films. We will look at the adaptations that an organism of this kind would have to possess not only to emit fire from its wings, but also to reach an internal temperature high enough to glow red hot. But first, as usual, let's get some context. Rodan, or Radon as it is originally known, is a kaiju, a monster whose conceptual origin is in Japan, first appearing in the film that bears his name, released in 1956. Radon is a contraction of Pteranodon, the name of a genus of extinct pterosaurs, and it is one of the most successful and prevalent kaiju in popular culture, which, just like some others, has made its way into different works and films on this side of the world, where the name was changed to Rodan to avoid confusion with the chemical element in the periodic table. As we mentioned at the beginning, in this speculative biology analysis we will center on the version of this kaiju that we can see in the 2019 film Godzilla, King of Monsters. In this version, Rodan is a form of life that belongs to the category of titans, colossal entities of mysterious origin which represent an embodiment of the forces of nature and of its struggle to achieve balance, while at the same time they are like primordial gods for humanity. Rodan is anatomically very similar to a gigantic pterosaur, and according to official material linked to the film, it is almost 47 meters tall, or 154 feet, with a wingspan of about 255 meters, or 871 feet, while its weight is nothing more and nothing less than 35,000 metric tons. It is a creature large and heavy enough to destroy cities solely with the air currents generated by the beating of its wings. This is impressive, however, the most striking feature in the physiology of this kaiju, at least in my opinion, are the high temperatures that its body reaches and which it can apparently emit at will. When Rodan flies, it not only leaves a trail of fire and ashes, but its deep tissues also clearly glow red hot with the heat that its body produces. We're talking about temperatures at least as high as 500 or 600 degrees Celsius to reach the red emission phenomenon that we can observe. Life at those temperatures is something that does not exist on our planet, but to explain the biology behind Rodan, we do have several mechanisms to which we can resort. The first problem the physiology of this kaiju would obviously face is the evaporation of water, whose boiling point is barely 100 degrees Celsius. An organism subjected to such temperatures would rapidly lose not only its life but also all the water in its cells. However, there are multiple factors that could help this kaiju when it comes to overcoming this limitation. The first, and probably the most important one, is pressure. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at atmospheric pressure, but as the pressure of the environment increases, the boiling point of water also rises. This is what explains the ability of some hyperthermophilic organisms not only to survive, but even to thrive in volcanic fumaroles. The most heat-tolerant form of life that exists on our planet is Geogemma barosi, an archaeon that survives at temperatures as high as 130 degrees Celsius, substantially above the boiling point of water, in great part thanks to the elevated pressure of the ocean floor in which it inhabits. Thus, a high internal pressure could be a factor behind Rodan's high resilience to heat, but this is of course not enough. There are additional factors that could allow the existence of viable cells beyond the boiling point of water, like the ones that Rodan's body would have to possess. And one of these additional factors is the presence of certain solutes in water. Pure water does not behave the same way as salt water when exposed to certain temperatures. A practical example of this is how in some countries salt is spread on the pavement precisely to prevent ice from forming in order to reduce traffic accidents. Salt water not only freezes at a lower temperature than pure water, but it also boils at higher temperatures. This phenomenon, in which a solute such as salt, alters the boiling point of a solvent, like water, is known as ebullioscopic elevation. Now we can add all of these factors. It would be expected that within Rodan's body there exists not only a very high temperature but also a very high internal pressure, and that its cells are loaded not necessarily with salt, but more likely with proteins or other organic solutes specialized in generating an intense ebullioscopic elevation. All of this in order to maintain water water in a liquid state within its cells. Now, this brings us to another problem: protein denaturation. Even if we ignore the boiling point of water, heat also has the capacity to deform or denature proteins. A clear and visible example of this is how heat alters the properties of egg albumin when we cook it, or the contractile proteins in meat when we roast it. To avoid being cooked alive, Rodan would have to possess powerful mechanisms to preserve the structure of its proteins. And once again, in real living beings, we have systems that could help us explain this. Perhaps one of the most important ones would be what are known as heat shock proteins, a broad group of proteins that our cells produce not only under conditions of thermal stress, but also under stress in general. One of their most important functions is serving as chaperone proteins. This means that they are proteins that, let's say, care for or guide other proteins to ensure that they fold into an adequate structure. To put it simply, these are proteins specialized in preventing the denaturation or misfolding of other proteins. They are structural guides, safeguarding against the damages that can be produced, among other things, by heat. In this case, they would be one of the many available tools to explain the physiology of a creature like Rodan. Now, regardless of chaperone proteins, there are other mechanisms to prevent the denaturation of these kind of compounds. For example, we could talk about proteins that are inherently resistant to heat, and perhaps the best example of this would be prions. Prions are anomalous proteins that stand out for their ability to produce neurodegenerative diseases that are incurable, 100% lethal, and that also have the potential to be contagious. Prions are the cause behind pathologies such as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, better known as mad cow disease, but they also provoke Kuru, a disease related to cannibalism, as well as fatal familial insomnia that are truly material for nightmares. The point is that the prions which cause these diseases are characteristically heat-resistant proteins. They possess a structure so stable that it is very difficult to denature them even with standard sterilization temperatures. Some of the proteins present in Rodan could have structural patterns similar or at least analogous to those of prions, granting them greater stability against heat. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that Rodan would necessarily suffer from prion diseases, only that its proteins could share the structural traits of prions in order to be more resistant to temperature. But we can go one step further. As you probably know, a protein is basically a chain of amino acids, and the type or specific variety of amino acids in a protein is also fundamental to explaining its resistance not only to heat but also to other aggressions such as acids. The reason behind this goes beyond the scope of this video, but to put it simply, the amino acids in a single protein can establish bonds between each other, ionic or hydrogen bridges that give greater structural solidity to the protein they compose, which in turn grants resistance against physical and chemical aggressions. I believe all of these factors could help us explain the viability of the proteins in Rodan's cells even with an elevated internal temperature. Rodan could also possess proteins with enzymatic functions specialized in repairing the possible damages generated by heat, especially the damage inflicted on genetic material, DNA repair proteins, but also structural proteins to minimize such damage. Even in humans, DNA is protected by special proteins called histones, which also help to organize it and regulate its function. Now, beyond temperatures and water, there are other problems. We already mentioned that Rodan would have not only a very high internal temperature, but also a very high internal pressure. And this is also damaging for cells, which would end up deforming and dying under such aggression. Cells can die due to mechanical damage as well. After all, they are nothing more than tiny little bags filled with complex chemical reactions. But if that little bag ruptures, life simply ceases to exist. For this reason, different types of cells have developed different strategies to avoid rupturing. Plants, for example, reinforce the surface of their cells with a wall made out of cellulose, the very same substance that makes up paper. Fungi, on the other hand, reinforce the membrane of their cells with a wall composed of chitin, the same substance that makes up the exoskeleton of insects. And for their part, animal cells, which includes human cells, use a special form of fat that we all know and love, cholesterol, Cholesterol provides rigidity while at the same time flexibility to the membrane of our cells, and thanks to it, animal cells do not depend on a cell wall. In the case of hyperthermophilic archaea and bacteria, their cell membranes contain other specialized forms of fat that help them maintain their shape in the high temperature and high pressure conditions in which they live. But even so, this seems to me to be an insufficient explanation, and here is where diatoms come in. Diatoms are a group of unicellular algae that, among other things, are characterized by possessing a cell wall composed of bioceramics, a material resistant to both heat and pressure. We could expect that the cells that make up Rodan's body possess a similar cellular mechanism in order to guarantee the integrity of their structure, a resistant cell wall of bioceramics, similar although not necessarily identical to the one diatoms possess. The problem with a mechanism like this would be, above all, the muscles. Ceramics are rigid and would prevent the contraction of muscle fibers, which need to shorten in order to generate movement. However, there are ways to overcome this problem, at least theoretically. The first thing we need to keep in mind is that muscle fibers, even in human beings, constitute what is known as a syncytium. A muscle fiber is not made up of many separate cells, but rather, in reality, is a large joint cellular mass combined into one unit. Functionally, we are talking about giant cells. In this way, Rodan's muscle tissue would not have to deal with a great quantity of cells, each one with its own cell wall, but rather with a single unit of cell wall. And if this wall is not continuous, but instead has gaps or some form of overlap, something similar to a scale armor, then mobility is more than possible. And in fact, something very similar is what happens in diatoms, whose cell wall is not single and continuous, but instead is formed by two sheets that overlap with each other. Now, it is not enough to explain the mechanisms to overcome heat. It would also be convenient to explain the reason behind Rodan's high body temperatures. To maintain such an elevated internal temperature, most of these creatures' metabolism would be concentrated solely and exclusively on generating heat, although it is also likely that its tissues could also take it directly from the environment, something more than viable considering that it literally inhabits in a volcano. But even so, Rodan can keep its temperature when away of its natural habitat, so it must possess some form of temperature regulation. Beyond this, given that this version of the kaiju can feed directly on radiation, it is possible that Rodan does not have to consume too much food to maintain its high metabolism. It could consume radioactive material and extract energy directly from it over centuries or even millennia. I also think that the outer layers of rock-like tissue serve as a form of insulation, and it probably is in fact solidified magma and not really a tissue. In any case, thanks to its extreme physiology, this creature would have clear biological advantages. To begin with, it would be practically immune to all known pathogens. Perhaps within the monsterverse there might exist some bacteria or pathogens capable of making it sick, but within human knowledge of the real world, Rodan could lack an immune system without any kind of problems. He would be protected by the most extreme fever of all creation. On the other hand, the large amount of heat it produces could help it remain in flight despite its incredible weight. Hot air tends to rise, and this might explain the fiery trail it leaves when flying. Rodan would be substantially heating the air intentionally in order to support itself in the sky. But the truth is that, realistically, perhaps the hardest thing to explain about this kaiju is its ability to fly despite its enormous reported weight and relatively reduced size. That and the fact that water beyond 374 degrees Celsius enters a state of matter known as supercritical fluid, and we do not know how this state interacts with the components of life beyond, of course, destroying them. But I believe that with some small suspension of disbelief, this is an acceptable explanation not only for Rodan but also for other science fiction creatures that possess a very high internal temperature. Guys, if you enjoyed this video and want to support my content, consider subscribing, but above all, feeding the algorithm with a comment. This is a relatively new channel, so I would really appreciate it if you could help me make it grow. With that said, I'll take my leave and we'll see each other in the next video.